July 14th, 1584. The heart of Delft is boiling with bodies and bloodlust. Thousands crush against each other in the searing summer heat, eyes fixed on the wooden platform rising from the town square like a sacrificial altar. On it stands a man barely alive, barely human. His feet have been roasted to the bone with red-hot irons. Strips of skin hang from his arms like butcher's cloth. He doesn't scream anymore. He can't. His voice gave out hours ago, but his eyes, swollen bloodshot, still burn with a twisted fire. 4 horses stand at each corner of the platform, muscles tensed, chains tied to the man's wrists and ankles. At a single signal, they will run in opposite directions and rip him limb from limb while he's still breathing. And the crowd will cheer. They're not here for justice. They're here for theater, because this isn't just any execution, it's the most elaborate public torture ever staged in the Low Countries. And the man at the center of it is no ordinary criminal. His name is Balthazar Gerard, a 27-year-old religious zealot who pulled the trigger on one of the most powerful men in Europe. 10 days ago, he walked into a palace disguised as a friend and assassinated William of Orange, the father of the Dutch nation, the leader of the Protestant revolt against Spain. What followed wasn't just political chaos. It was emotional detonation. The Netherlands erupted in rage. And now, with Gerard strapped to chains like a human sacrifice, the country is ready to watch him die piece by piece. But how did a soft-spoken Catholic boy become one of the most reviled assassins in European history? What drove him to kill a national hero and accept a death this cruel? The answers lie in a chilling descent into fanaticism, deception, and a state-sponsored promise of divine redemption. 10 days before the horses tore him apart, Balthazar Gerard changed the future of Europe with the pull of a trigger. It happened in a quiet hallway of the Prinsenhof Palace in Delft, a space usually reserved for private strategy and whispered counsel. But on that day, July 10th, 1584, it became the stage for a nation's heartbreak. William of Orange, known as the Silent, the man who had defied Spanish tyranny for over a decade, collapsed in a pool of his own blood after taking 2 bullets to the chest. He didn't die in battle, didn't fall at the front of an army. He was murdered in cold blood by a man who had smiled, bowed, and prayed beside him. The news spread like wildfire, not just across the Netherlands, but across the entire continent. Protestants wept. Catholics whispered. Monarchs panicked. Because this wasn't just the death of a man, it was the attempted assassination of an entire revolution. William had been more than a political leader. He was the soul of the Dutch resistance, the fragile glue holding together a rebellion against one of the most powerful empires in the world, Catholic Spain, under King Philip II. And now he was gone, struck down not in open war, but through deceit from within his own circle. For the people of the Netherlands, it felt like the ultimate betrayal, a blade to the back of their freedom. It wasn't just that their leader was dead, it was that he had let his killer in. And that single act of violence cracked the illusion of safety, of justice, of moral order. If William of Orange could be murdered like this, what hope was left for anyone? That's when fear turned to rage, and rage demanded blood. But Balthazar Gerard didn't become a killer overnight. His bullets were fired in Delft, but the gunpowder was packed years earlier in the quiet, candlelit corridors of a Jesuit school deep in the Franche-Comté. Born in 1557 into a devout Catholic family under Spanish rule, Balthazar was raised not just on scripture, but on fear. From the moment he could walk, he was told that heretics roamed the earth like wolves in disguise, that the Protestant Reformation was not merely a disagreement, but a cosmic rebellion against God himself. And at the center of this apocalyptic narrative stood the Dutch, a nation of traitors, rebels, and agents of Satan. The Jesuits didn't teach him to think, they taught him to worship certainty, to see doubt as sin, and to believe that martyrdom was not just noble, but necessary. While boys his age were learning to fight or farm, Balthazar was memorizing the doctrines of war disguised as theology. To him, the Protestant world wasn't just wrong, it was diseased. And like any disease, it needed to be purged. The Spanish Inquisition didn't reach into every home, but its shadow did. It crept into sermons, bedtime stories, school books. It whispered that killing a heretic wasn't murder, it was mercy. And this idea, poison wrapped in piety, took root in Balthazar's mind like a thorned vine. By the time he was a teenager, he didn't just despise the Dutch cause. He believed destroying it was his divine obligation. What the world would later call terrorism, he understood as salvation. And the man he would one day kill, William of Orange, was not a human being in his eyes. He was the Antichrist, the devil in disguise. And Balthazar, he was God's knife. By the time Balthazar reached his 20s, he no longer needed sermons to tell him what to believe. His faith had evolved into obsession. And then in 1580, the Spanish crown gave him a reason to act. King Philip II, ruler of the vast Catholic Empire, defender of the faith, issued a royal edict that electrified Europe, a bounty of 25,000 gold escudos for the head of William of Orange. But this wasn't just a price, it was a promise. The king offered not only riches, but absolution. Whoever killed the Dutch heretic would receive full forgiveness of sins, hereditary nobility, and a place of honor in the service of God and Spain. It was an invitation to murder, draped in the robes of sainthood. For men like Balthazar, it wasn't just a reward, it was a divine calling. At last his hatred had been made holy. The king had turned vengeance into virtue, and the target was clear: William of Orange, the man he had feared and loathed since childhood. With one shot, Balthazar could buy eternal salvation and avenge the crime of Protestant rebellion. It wasn't just justice, it was prophecy, and he wasn't alone. Across Europe, Catholic fanatics, bounty hunters, and adventurers began hunting the Dutch leader like a sacred beast. One assassin managed to wound William in 1582, firing a bullet into his jaw, but failed to kill him. That failure only deepened Balthazar's resolve. Each missed attempt became a sacred echo in his mind. God had chosen him to finish what others couldn't. While the rest of Europe watched in silence, Balthazar began preparing for something far greater than death. He would trade his life for legacy, his soul for sainthood. In a world where kings made killers into martyrs, Balthazar was ready to become both. From the moment the bounty was declared, Balthazar Gerard disappeared not from the world, but into purpose. He became a shadow, with a heartbeat, moving through towns, studying maps and gathering whispers, like a monk gathering relics. While others saw Philip II's decree as a political act, Balthazar saw it as a sacred summons. He wasn't rushing toward violence. He was building a cathedral of murder, brick by brick, year by year. Assassination wasn't just a fantasy, it became the architecture of his life. He read everything he could about William of Orange, his sleeping habits, his guards, his routes between cities. He memorized the layout of the Prinsenhof Palace. He tracked failed assassins and studied their mistakes like a student of divine failure. Each misstep they made became part of his liturgy, reminders that God favored patience over passion. He didn't want to try. He wanted to succeed. And so he waited. Years passed, but the fire inside him never cooled. If anything, it refined. Balthazar became fluent in the language of his enemies: Protestant theology, Dutch culture, French politics. He was crafting not just an attack, but a disguise that would let him walk into the lion's den as a lamb. To the outside world, he was quiet, pious, forgettable. But inside, a storm raged. His soul had already committed the crime. His body was just catching up. By the early months of 1584, he was ready. Not just with weapons, but with certainty, the kind of certainty that turns men into tools of prophecy. This wasn't ambition. It was faith sharpened into a dagger. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Balthazar already saw the stage where he'd be executed not as punishment, but as coronation. In his twisted theology, death wasn't the end. It was the reward. When the time came to act, Balthazar didn't draw a sword, he wore a mask. With the precision of a stage actor and the conviction of a zealot, he assumed a new identity. François Guillon, a French Protestant nobleman who had allegedly renounced Catholicism to join the Dutch revolt. It was a lie built on sand, but he walked on it like stone. He had trained for this moment with the discipline of a soldier and the devotion of a martyr, and his performance was flawless. He spoke the language of the Reformation, fluently quoted scripture with Protestant fervor, and debated theology like a man who had wrestled angels. Every gesture was calculated, every word rehearsed. But what made him lethal wasn't just his disguise, it was his patience. Balthazar didn't storm the gates. He infiltrated the cracks. He began by attending small Protestant gatherings, making friends, giving donations. He volunteered for the rebel cause, handed out pamphlets denouncing Spain, and even wrote essays condemning the Catholic Church, the very church he believed he was serving. Like a spider spinning silk, he wrapped himself in credibility, and slowly, methodically, he ascended. From the outer circles of Dutch society, he wormed his way into the corridors of power. No one questioned him. Why would they? He was articulate, devout, generous, everything a good convert should be. And that was his genius. He didn't hide from suspicion. He earned trust. By the time he stood face to face with William of Orange, Balthazar wasn't an outsider looking in. He was an insider welcomed with open arms. What no one realized was that the man they embraced wasn't just a spy, he was a weapon blessed by kings and baptized in fire. And he was finally within reach of the man he believed God had marked for death. July 10, 1584. Delft. The day begins like any other quiet tense burdened with war. But within the walls of the Prinsenhof Palace, history is already waiting to bleed. William of Orange, now 51, rises early to news of Spanish troop movements near the border. As always, he is calm, composed, worn by years of rebellion. He's not just a prince anymore, he is the living symbol of Dutch resistance, a man who has survived battles, betrayals, and even a previous assassination attempt. And today he agrees to meet with a young nobleman who claims to have urgent intelligence about enemy forces, François Guillon. The name, the accent, the theology all seem trustworthy. After all, Guillon has proven himself a loyal patriot, a converted Catholic who speaks like a Protestant, prays like a rebel, and bleeds like one of them. William welcomes him into his private study. No guards, no suspicion, just trust the fatal kind. For nearly an hour they speak of maps and military maneuvers, unaware that death is sitting between them in the shape of a leather satchel. Inside it, 2 loaded wheel-lock pistols, and a prophecy waiting to be fulfilled. When William turns to examine a document on the table, Balthazar stands. For the glory of God and the Catholic King, he shouts, drawing the first pistol and firing into William's back. The bullet rips through lung and heart. William collapses, gasping, blood staining the parchment beneath him. But Balthazar isn't done. He draws the second pistol and fires again, ensuring the man he saw as the Antichrist cannot rise. For a few seconds, the world stands still. Then it breaks. Footsteps thunder. Guards shout. Balthazar runs, but fate limps behind him. The assassination is complete, and now the butcher must become the offering. The body of William of Orange was still warm when the city of Delft began to convulse. The first scream came from the palace hallway, the second from the square outside, and within an hour all of the Netherlands was howling. News of the assassination didn't spread, it erupted like a plague of grief laced with rage. William wasn't just a man. He was the heartbeat of a revolution, the father of a people who had dared to defy the world's most powerful empire. His murder wasn't seen as a political crime, it was a national crucifixion, a betrayal so intimate it bordered on cosmic. The man they had welcomed, trusted, prayed with, had slaughtered their savior inside his own home. It wasn't war, it was blasphemy. And Delft, once a city of cobbled calm, turned into a furnace. As Balthazar Gerard was dragged from the palace, broken from a failed escape attempt, the crowd surged like a living beast. Mothers wept. Men shouted for blood. Children stared wide-eyed at the man they were told had killed their future. Only the steel wall of armed guards kept the people from tearing him apart with their bare hands. But even that wouldn't protect him for long. The Dutch wanted justice, but they also wanted pain. The kind that lasts, that scars memory and soil. Gerard was locked in a dungeon, but the court of public fury had already sentenced him. They didn't want a quick execution. They wanted a message. Something so horrifying that no assassin would ever dare try again. And they would get it. Because in the coming days, the Dutch authorities would design an execution so methodical, so monstrous, that even the Inquisition would seem merciful by comparison. The assassin had taken a symbol. Now the state would make one out of him. They could have killed him quickly. A rope, a blade, a single bullet would have ended it. But that wasn't the point. The Dutch didn't want justice, they wanted a spectacle. Something unforgettable. Something biblical. And so on July 14th, 1584, the town square of Delft was transformed into a theater of agony. Merchants shuttered their shops. Farmers abandoned the fields. Children were lifted onto shoulders so they wouldn't miss the view. At the center stood a wooden platform glinting under the morning sun like a stage set for hell itself. Lined with glowing irons, hooked pincers, ropes, pulleys, and 4 restless horses, it promised not death, but performance. Balthazar Gerard was dragged out in chains, his face sunken but still defiant. He didn't beg. He didn't scream. As the crowd hurled curses and stones, he whispered Latin prayers and stared toward the sky as if expecting heaven to open. Then the torment began. First, his feet were burned with red-hot irons cooked to the bone, while the scent of human flesh soaked the air. Then came the pincers tearing skin off his arms, legs, chest in slow, deliberate intervals. The crowd winced, gasped, but never looked away. He was no longer a man. He was a canvas for vengeance. And still, they weren't finished. The executioners were trained not to kill, but to prolong. They pushed his body to the edge of death and pulled it back again and again like a cruel symphony conductor holding the final note. Hours passed. Blood puddled, flesh split. But Balthazar lived because the grand finale was yet to come. As chains were tied to his limbs and the horses were led into position, a silence fell over Delft. The nation's pain had become ritual. Now it was time for its sacrifice to be torn apart. When the ropes snapped his body in 4 directions, the crowd roared, but the story didn't end. What died on that platform in Delft wasn't just Balthazar Gerard, and what survived wasn't just the memory of his crime. In the days that followed, the Dutch authorities displayed his mutilated remains like trophies of national vengeance. Pieces of his body were nailed in public squares, his dismembered limbs held up as warnings to future traitors. But even in death, Balthazar refused to vanish. To the Dutch, he was a monster. To Catholic fanatics, he became a martyr. Secretly, sympathizers collected scraps of his clothing, drops of blood-soaked cloth, treating them as holy relics. In Spain, his name was whispered with reverence, his act interpreted not as murder, but as divine obedience. Balthazar had aimed to kill a man, but he'd unknowingly given birth to 2 legends, the martyr of fanaticism and the martyr of liberty, because William of Orange, cut down in his own home, became more powerful in death than in life. His son Maurice of Nassau took up his mantle with renewed fury. The Dutch resistance, once fragmented and weary, rallied around the memory of their fallen leader, now sanctified in blood. And Spain, the empire that thought it could crush rebellion with a single bullet, had created a symbol it could never silence. Artists carved the execution into woodcuts. Poets turned screams into ballads. Historians would one day call it one of the most detailed spectacles of judicial torture in European history. But underneath the gore and glory lies a warning. When faith becomes a weapon and propaganda becomes prophecy, men like Balthazar are not the disease, they are the symptom. And the crowd that cheers their death may already be infected. More than 4 centuries have passed since Balthazar Gerard pulled the trigger. His bones have long turned to dust, but his story refuses to fade. And maybe that's because it isn't really about him. His name is just the vessel. The real story is about how ideas, when weaponized, can turn ordinary people into monsters, and how societies, when blinded by vengeance, can turn justice into theater. Balthazar wasn't born a killer. He was shaped, molded by sermons, state-sponsored hatred, and the seductive promise of eternal reward. He believed he was saving the world. And in a way, that's what makes him terrifying. Evil done in the name of evil is predictable, but evil done in the name of righteousness, that's the kind that survives centuries, and we're still living with it. In today's world, where extremism is once again dressed in the language of purity, and where violence is framed as a form of salvation, the story of Balthazar Gerard feels less like ancient history and more like a warning we've ignored. It reminds us that radicalism doesn't always look like madness. It often looks like certainty. It wears the smile of a patriot, the words of a prophet, the calm conviction of a man who believes his cause justifies anything. But here's the truth: no cause, no crown. No God justifies the loss of our shared humanity. And if we forget that if we let fear or ideology strip away our empathy, we become part of the same machinery that tortured Balthazar to death in front of cheering crowds. So maybe the lesson is this: beware the people who claim absolute truth. Be slow to dehumanize your enemies, and never ever let belief outrun compassion. Because history doesn't just repeat, it remembers who we choose to be, too. If this story made you feel something: shock, sorrow, or even just curiosity, don't let it end here. Drop a comment and tell us what you think. Was Balthazar a madman, a martyr, or something more disturbing? Save this video so you can revisit the lesson history tried to teach us. And if you want more stories that uncover the dark, forgotten corners of our past, subscribe and join us. Because the deeper we dig into history, the more we uncover about ourselves.